Okay, report writing. I am going to share my screen with you. And I am going to take it back to the beginning. And if you have questions as I go along, please ask. My first question for you. I'm sure you've written team reports before for other projects. What was the biggest problem you found with them? Or was writing the report the best part of the project? What kinds of issues did you have to deal with when it came to writing in or writing and submitting a report? Mike is saying it's hard to coordinate. Yes, it is, quite definitely. Anyone else? So just in case, I'll name a few of those other problems from my own experience. You're dependent on someone else to get you information that is essential to include in the report, and that person doesn't get you the information you need. You write the report and then you discover it's written in 5 individual voices instead of 1. The next problem that I found, and this really did happen in industry, was that not everyone had a clear understanding of the purpose of the project or the intent of the report. And so people would wander off onto odd tangents. The next problem is one person wrote the entire report, which is never, ever supposed to happen. And it's certainly not to happen on your teams because you need an identifiable section that you individually have written. That is required. The next problem is someone decides to sit down and edit the report all by themselves. That is also not to happen on your project. Everyone is to review the report, and if editing needs to be done, you will all do it. Finally, teams that don't decide on a style sheet ahead of time. And so there is a massive scramble at the last second to format the report so it looks like a team report instead of 5 individuals who chose different heading styles and things like that. The last problem is that one or more members don't track the sources they use. And so they have not used a standard reference style, and they haven't included their references in their section of the report. So these are all things that you can slow down or cope with ahead of time with a bit of planning. So there is a difference in business writing. Report is not the same as an essay. Part of the reason for that is because business writing, as I emphasized last week and the week before, places the question or the objective or the purpose first. Keep in mind that in academic writing, what we're trained to do, especially in essay writing, is to place the question that we're trying to answer or the thesis that we're trying to respond to at the end of the introduction. Business reverses that order. Remember that business writing can be stylish, but it's also there to save people work. So the more efficient you are about getting information visual and upfront, the better off your reader will be. So business reverses that order by placing the purpose of the report first, right at the front of the introduction. Usually it then goes, I'll be going into more detail about the introduction shortly, but it then goes into detail about the rationale and the context, this situation, the problem, et cetera, and the reason that the research has been done. Second important point is in business writing, you always avoid making the reader do work. So this is along the same lines as sending me an email as a member of this class to ask me a question or to get something like deferred standing and to find out if I will sign your form. Keep in mind, your subject line in an email should be informative so that I know what class you're in. I know the reason that you're emailing me right in the subject line. Business report does the exact same thing. So we need an informative title. You start with the title, you make it informative. Next, unlike essays, well, it depends on the subject, but unlike essays, you always use headings and subheadings to divide up a report, to create a logical flow through the report. And in essence, if I've read your report, keeping in mind that reports are often read more than once, I can quickly find the specific section that I need to find the specific detail that I want to look up in your report. This also makes the report easier in some ways to write if you design it well, because you're writing in short bursts instead of in great long sections. Finally, terse, clear language. Ambiguity is rarely tolerated in business reports. It causes problems, as I've said before. So accuracy is the hallmark. Being concise is another hallmark. You need terse, clear language that doesn't go off into flourishes. You want to avoid complex sentence structures. At the same time, you want to have flow, because reading subject, verb, object, can be pretty darn boring for the reader. Nevertheless, if you have to, use it, because the essential thing is to get accurate information and evidence across to us so that there is no room for misunderstanding. Thirdly, there is this genre that we call a business report, and there are all kinds of subgenres within it, which means there is one overall report category, and then there are a multitude of report types within that. To determine the subgenre, generally speaking, you look to the audience, you look to the situation. It could be such a thing as you're writing a report for this class as opposed to writing a report for an engineering or science discipline. So if I look at various subgenres of reports, there is the general business report that you're doing in this class, where you are reporting on a question, a problem, or a situation. You're doing research into it. You are putting forth your conclusions, and you're also putting forth calls to action in the form of recommendations. Another subgenre in the, I think we should say, mansion of report styles is a lab report. People do these all the time in science and engineering. They follow very rigid sections and expectations for those disciplines. The type of report that you're writing and who you're writing it for often determines the structure and the language that you use in it. So if you're working for a specific company and you are reporting on a new procedure that you want the company to use, generally speaking, you're writing that to convince managers, possibly several layers of managers. You have to keep that audience in focus to make sure that your language is appropriate, but you also have to look at the company's preferred style of report, to look at the structure, the design, et cetera, for that particular style of report that you're writing. Moving my little Zoom section around. So as I have just said, in any type of report, you are clearly communicating a problem, question, or situation that you're doing some kind of work on or research into. You are providing the research or evidence that supports the solution or answer that you've decided upon. In some instances, you're also going to include why other options or alternatives are not feasible. In other words, If you're recommending a new process, there may be several ways to put that process in place. You're going to put recommendations for, say, 3 of them in. You may recommend the first one as ideal, the second one as a compromise, and the third one as no-go. Could be, though, that the first one is really expensive, and so you think the compromise solution will be chosen. You also always include a recommended solution or answer or process. The sections of a report do vary with report types, but overall, what you will always find is a title page, and I expect you to hand one in. It should have the company information, the team information, and the report title on it, not just the team's full names, preferred names, but also a means of contacting them, such as their email addresses. It should look professional, not hard to do. You can make up your own logo, you can put York's logo on it, you can do whatever you like, so long as it looks professional and contains the information we need with your informative title prominent. Secondly, here is a section I have not asked you to write, but I want you to be aware of it. You will be asked to write these on future reports, or you may already have done so. That's an executive summary. It's the very last thing you write in your report. And that's because it is a very high level, 1-page summary of the report's purpose, the main points or evidence you found, your conclusions, and the recommendations you're making. It takes skill to write a 1-page summary for a 25 or 50-page report. Your reports are far shorter. So an executive summary for yours would be possibly half a page. Executive summaries are always single-spaced to use up that room, and they are rarely more than 1 page long. We'll get to audience in a minute, and you'll see why that is usually an important part of the report. I am expecting you to include a table of contents, and your table of contents must have the name of the person or people who wrote each section on it to identify them. There is a way of automating your table of contents if you choose a style sheet and have the entire team use it, so that you don't have to type out every section, every subheading, every page number, which reminds me, you need to paginate your reports by inserting page numbers. The table of contents, a lot of people just think of this as, why do we do this? As I tell my engineering students, it's an essential tool for navigation. So I can tell at a glance from a table of contents if your report has been well designed by the subheadings and the headings that you include in it. It also allows me as a manager, keeping in mind that time when I was project manager for 11 different writing projects at a single time. Someone gives me a report, I don't just read it once and grade it and stockpile it with a smile on my face as I do for this class. In fact, previous team projects, the really good ones, I actually do pass on to members of faculty who might be interested in looking at the solutions you found. So this is not just an academic project, it may actually be used. In order to do that, in order to show people a particularly telling piece of evidence, or if I'm doing an engineering or development project, I need a particular detail, your table of contents should lead me there. I should be able to look at the sections and go, oh yeah, I remember now where it was. I can flip to that section. I can go directly to the information I need without having to read through the whole thing. So tables of contents, you should be using them as a revision tool. It's like writing an outline. Your table of contents, if you look at it, you see the logic and flow of your report. So that's part of the reason why it's required. The introduction to the report, I will go into more detail in a minute. It outlines the scope of your project. Well, first the purpose, then the context, the situation or problem, and also the scope, the limitations, so that you make your project manageable. The middle of your report, the design of it is specific to the individual report. You can follow genre guidelines to come up with headings and subheadings, but essentially no two reports are alike in the order of information within a particular subsection. And for this class, no two reports will probably have the middles designed exactly the same. You always include, depending on the genre of the report, a section called conclusions. It might be conclusions and recommendations, but there is always a closing section that states briefly and concisely your findings. And that should flow from the middle section of your report so that the conclusions follow logically from the research you've done. The difference between a conclusion is a research finding. That is what you came up with as answers to your research question. Recommendations are calls to action. There's a lot of confusion along these 2 points, and I'll give an example of these in a few minutes. There is always a references section. It always uses the standard reference style. I have left it up to you, to each team, to choose the style that they are going to use, but I will point out you need in-text references in each and every person's work, and we need a list of them formatted in the same standard style. It might be MLA or APA or Chicago, but every member of the team needs to follow the same format. After the references are the appendices. That is, if you need them. And I'll talk about those in a minute. Let's talk about audience now for reports. You have multiple audiences for every single report that you write. The executive summary, the introduction, the recommendations and conclusions are always read by high-level management. And that's who you're targeting in those sections of the report, especially the executive summary. You can see why. If an executive summary is a single-page summary of your entire report that actually lays out those conclusions and recommendations, high-level management should be able to read it and understand exactly what you are telling the company they should do. Your introduction, the body of the report with specific evidence, your recommendations and conclusions, and the appendices will probably be read by an immediate supervisor or immediate management, with a caveat that high-level management, if they're interested, may read the whole thing. Reports are not usually read in the order that you write them. The reading order that most readers follow is the executive summary. They then go right to the recommendations and conclusions. They may go back to the introduction, and they would then go to the body. The reason for this is simple. Once again, you gain a high-level overview for reading the executive summary. If you've read it, then you know what the project is about, and the introduction repeats that information. You then want to know what the team found. That's why you go to the recommendations and conclusions. You may want to go back to the introduction to see if there were limitations on scope of the project, and to read in more detail that information. You would then dive into the body. I would note that the evidence you set out in the body or the middle of the report absolutely has to support the recommendations and conclusions. So this is part of the reason why you never write a report the night before. It's like asking me to write a 150-page programming manual in 2 days. I mean, you can't do it. You can write a 25-page report overnight. I have done it, but frankly, it's not going to be very good. You need to be more coordinated and more organized so that that never happens to you. In my case, it was an emergency, and it had to be done, so I did it, but I sure wasn't proud of it. So a lot of people tend to think, and once again, I am speaking from my experience in industry, and I'm also speaking from my experience in many disciplines in academics, because I have worked across the full gamut from engineering and science through to practically all the humanities subjects and some of the social sciences, and certainly business. The problem is that many people think that writing the report is the last step that you take when you have done an experiment or done research about a question. Well, that's not the case. You should be writing up your research as you go before you forget it, and doing it in small sections as you uncover the research, you can then look at everything you've done and draft your particular section of the report about your findings, your individual findings, in a coherent form. The team can then get together and look at all of those and decide what goes where and if new writing needs to be done. At the same time, it is incredibly important to remember that writing is learning. We uncover insights, we do analysis as we write, we order things in our minds as we write. Writing is discovery, and that's part of the reason why I have all of my students start their reports early. So I am expecting you to have a draft done for next week, because logically speaking, you can't design a presentation without a draft of your report ready to go. So instead of thinking of the report as the last step in a project, the report is ongoing. As part of the planning for any kind of report or presentation, you've already done this. You've already decided, presumably, who's going to do research into what. You've already decided what needs to be done. You may need to adjust your planned schedules to get the report done earlier than you expected. Part of your planning, and I can't tell you how incredibly important this is to save you immense amount of works later on, is to decide on the templates and styles for the report that every member of your team is going to use, so that every single member of the team uses those for your individual sections. So I'm going to take this down for a second and bring up Word. And what have we got here? Let's bring up a new document. When you hit open for a new document, you do have all kinds of templates that you can use. You may find something useful in here, such as this is Office Manager. It's a design cover. You will find templates for reports in here. You don't have to use them. You can make up your own. You can go to a blank document and type in nonsense.
We're unable to see anything.
Oh, sorry.
It's still on the PowerPoint.
Thank you. Thanks very much, Edgar. So I'm just going to type in nonsense, and I want to do this live. And I'm going to type in nonsense several times. Many of you will already be aware of this, but some of you may not. So if you don't want to choose a template because you find that too confining, then you simply go to Word, you select whatever. You have all kinds of styles that you can use. You use heading 1. I want this to be my main heading, so I'm going to call this introduction. You can number your headings or not, as you like. Many reports do that. The next one, I'm going to right click again. And this time I am going to pick heading 2. And I'm going to say this is 1.1 as a section number. And this is my subheading level 1. Some teams may find that they need a section 1.1.1. They need a lower level heading. And so I can simply go back to styles and I can choose heading 3. You can actually edit. I have found that the indentations on reports, when you do it this way, wastes a lot of space. You do want white space in reports, but you don't want too much. So if I go to styles and I pick heading 1, I should be able to edit this. I go to home and I go to styles. I come up with a list of them. And I simply go to modify. You can modify the heading styles to create your own unique design. Generally speaking, I don't change the, what do you call it? The words normal settings. I change this to heading 1, Team Andrea, so that I'm creating a unique one. I can then change the font. I can change the spacing. I can add it to the styles gallery, etc., etc. I can do whatever I like with it. There are all kinds of things you can do simply by hitting format. The important thing is, whatever styles you choose, if you do not use heading levels like this that are done by styles, somebody is going to have to manually type out that table of contents and the page numbers. And if you do not do that, if you do use the styles, then nobody has to type out the table of contents. There is a way in Word to automate it. Presumably there is the same thing in Google Docs. Can you tell me, please, are you seeing my PowerPoints again?
Yep, we are.
Okay, great. Thanks again.
No
So it is incredibly important that you make these decisions ahead of time, because then it's a case of everybody's going to use them. You will find when it comes to the final report, there is no desperate scramble at the end to make the report look professional. I strongly suggest that if you haven't done so yet, your team get together and take 15 minutes to write the introduction together. That is because every member of the team needs the knowledge of the purpose, the project description, etc., etc. Remembering the purpose should come first. It gives everyone common ground. You are all writing to the same purpose. That's especially important on development teams when you have been tasked with doing something and you need to make your understanding of that clear. You may also need to limit the scope of your project. So for example, one of the teams in my tutorial is looking at the impact of different types of music on studying, as I understand the project. They are going to have to limit the types of music that they choose because obviously they can't cover everything. So their introduction should state that. It describes the scope of the project itself. It is important that the entire team, I mean, one person can draft this, but everybody else needs to review it and make suggestions for revision so that it is a common section. When you are writing and revising, once again, as individuals, try to draft the headings and the subheadings of your section as you're doing the research. When you reach the conclusions and recommendations, remembering that you can't do that until every member of the team has turned in their individual written section. You need to be able to read them to draft the conclusions and recommendations based on the evidence from the body of the report. So the entire team should be drafting the conclusions and recommendations. The team needs to look at the middle of the report using, I strongly suggest, your automatic table of contents function so that there is consistency across the headings and subheadings of each section. Sometimes you can't do that because there is always some kind of unique point in one of those sections. And, you do it. But overall, when I'm reading your report or anyone else's, there should be some kind of consistency of design throughout the various sections. You add the references section to the end. And once again, each member should be doing their own citations, and they should do their level best to do it in the agreed upon style. I mean, you can Google how to do that. The entire team has to read the entire report and organize it or revise it for its organization, its flow, its logic, and its design. The team should read it again for a sentence level and a common voice. So it doesn't look like 5 people are writing it. It looks like you are a team with a common voice. Teams always object to proofreading, but I cannot tell you how many reports I have read that really could have used proofreading. Silly mistakes, silly typos that could have been caught by spell check or words editor. So it's incredibly important. Keep in mind that when we write something as individuals, it is often difficult for us to pick up the typos, the missing words, et cetera, et cetera. That's part of the importance of having the entire team read, because members who haven't written the section can often pick up on those mistakes. When you are writing professionally, professional means not only a logically designed report with good evidence, it means a polished report that does not have typos and missing words and mistakes. The reason for that is very important. It has to do with credibility. In other words, if we read a report and it is full of language errors, such as missing words, and it's got misspelled words, and I've come across this before too, there are actual unfinished sentences. Somebody wrote a sentence and just left it dangling. How can I trust the content of the report if the writing itself doesn't give me a sense that the team has been organized and not rushed and has taken the time to proofread? So your credibility is on the line. You want to make everything as polished and professional as possible. Here is a sample table of contents for a report. What is the problem or the problems with it? Please tell me in the online chat. It's got the executive summary, the table of contents, the introduction, resources at York, resources at University 1, University 2, University 3, conclusions and recommendations. And let us say that the purpose of the reports is to assess resources for international students at York, first-year international students. Yep, don't write short forms of words. You need to write introduction, not intro. Robert's pointed out very wisely, there are no page numbers, so I'm not going to be able to find anything. There is no references or works cited section. Yes, absolutely. There are no appendices. Yeah, Edgar, that's a good point. You may not need them, but you might. So there are no appendices. What about the design of resources at Uni 1, resources at Uni 2, resources at Uni 3? Yes, Verida, you are absolutely right in saying this is vague and you should be specific. They are indistinguishable from each other, absolutely. If I had not told you the presumable purpose of this report, I'm doing something, oh yay, my cup stuck to the table and I thought it might spill all over. Andrea has named the universities instead of numbering them. Yes, absolutely. Uni 1, Uni 2, and Uni 3 mean nothing to me. Tell me something. If you were reading this report and I hadn't told you its purpose, could you tell what this team was studying from this table of contents? Edgar's saying no. Do you have suggestions for what this team might do? I mean, typically this is a way to split up the research. If you're looking at, resources for international students, you would look at York and then you would look at some other universities. So I'm going to keep going into designing your report. The first thing you have to do, and the reason your introduction is incredibly important, is you need a clear purpose or question because the team has to study it. And then you need to look at your solution and your recommendations or your rough ones. You design your report based on the purpose and then conclusions and recommendations. It could be that every member has drafted out their research findings. And then you find when it comes to the actual report itself, you may be taking parts of that research and putting it into different sections based on the conclusions and recommendations you design after you've read each individual member's research. So over the course of the project, you need to share your research results with your teammates and you need to discuss them. And you need to see where everyone in total's research findings are leading to. The design that you saw here is what I call ducks in a row. It's called, one of the reasons you're not getting a really good sense of what this report is about is because resources at York only takes up one section. And then doing University 1, University 2, University 3 is what I call ducks in a row, where you're just discussing things in the easiest order for you, and you're not thinking about the reader. So it's like lining up your research instead of amalgamating it. Keep in mind that the body of the report has to lead logically to your recommendations and conclusions. So here is a better example. We have the usual section. I didn't have time to put in the references section on this one slide, so you can assume it's there. Yes, Andrea, add more subheadings such as specific resources for each university. That would be an excellent idea. To answer the question about do recommendations have to be in the conclusion or can it be said at the end of each section and a summary of it in the conclusion? That's a really good question. Some reports lead to one method of doing it. Some reports lead to another. Since you are doing individual sections of the report that presumably answer part of the research question, you may want to include a summary of the findings that you as an individual came to and that your team has agreed to for that section of the report. And you then make overall conclusions in a section at the end. The calls to action are called recommendations. Once again, it's a case of recommendations, conclusions and recommendations. The overall conclusions and recommendations will always come at the end of the report so that we can find them easily. But You may want to put individual conclusions and calls to action in the form of recommendations at the end of each section so that we can see where you're going. If you find it repetitive to do that, then you can move them. But it's actually very helpful for your teammates if you actually draft those in when you have finished your research. So I'm sorry I can't give you a conclusive do this or do that, but it really is going to matter on when you look at the draft of your report, which makes more sense. So here's a better example using the same international students example. We have main headings: intro, resources available at York, strengths of York's research, strategies for innovation and improvement. And then we have conclusions and recommendations followed by your references at the end. Please notice when we look at the subsections under resources available at York, we have language and writing resources, Canadian culture resources, and other subsections as needed. Under strengths, we have subsections as needed. You probably would not have the same subheadings under this section. We then have strategies for innovation and improvement. This section may actually amalgamate the research that several people have done. You will notice that it begins like the earlier section, resources available. Language and writing resources, instead of Canadian culture resources, cultural resources, and other subsections to follow. This section, the strategies for innovation and improvement, may be fairly lengthy, which means that several people can write different parts of it. And if you do this well, somebody may focus on language and writing resources and may take research that a couple of other team members have done and may write that section. It's identified as theirs. Cultural resources, the same thing may happen, and the other subsections, that may happen as well. As long as you can identify who wrote what for the subsections, you are fine. I want you to keep in mind that a theme of this entire course has been show us, don't tell us. We've seen that from Portfolio 1 on, that you do not merely tell us. These are our conclusions, these are our recommendations. You need evidence in the middle to show us that your conclusions and recommendations are logical. So, for instance, if you're designing a new project, like a website or a social media campaign or a periodical, you don't end your report with the new design. Keep in mind that part of what you have to do if you're designing such things, if this is a company report, you need to justify your design. You need to do research into design, and you need to look at the company or the institution, such as York, to justify the design choices you have made. And in keeping with a business report, you do not save all the surprises for the end. We need to know the purpose of your report from the beginning, and we need to know what design you're recommending near the beginning of the middle. So you need to show us the design. You need to justify by showing us references or showing us examples. You need to justify the design. In the same way, if you are, to go back to an earlier example, looking at resources for international students at York, you need to show us the evidence of what York has available by referring to their websites. You also need to show in the innovations and strategies section, if you're making recommendations for change for York, you do have to justify it, not through mere personal opinion, but by using sources. In reports, of course, you're allowed to use illustrations, especially if you're doing something like designing a social media campaign. If you want to show us examples of what you're recommending, then by all means, put illustrations in. That's why I gave you a rough word count of the amount individuals have to write, 750 words per person, roughly speaking, rather than a page count, just in case you have to illustrate on the grounds of show us, don't just tell us. Keep in mind in business, again, unlike a short story or creative writing, you're not trying to keep us in suspense. We need to know immediately what you're recommending, in the sense of, yes, you will put those at the end, but we also need some sense of what you're doing. Near the beginning of the report, depending on which project you show, you do need to, which project you've chosen, pardon me, you do need to show that you've considered alternative options. It's like engineers trying to build a bridge in a particular area of Toronto. Their design choice is going to be, to an extent, predicated on the context. Where is this bridge going? Who's going to be using it? In other words, is it going to be traffic, pedestrian, and bicycle, or a combination of two of the three of those? Safety factors have to be taken into consideration, et cetera, et cetera. So if you're building a bridge, you are going to consider alternative design structures. So the parts of a title page are pretty straightforward. Please keep in mind that you're writing your title. It should give the essence of your objective or purpose. So we should be able to tell at a glance what your report is about. Generally speaking, you also include the person of the unit that the report is addressed to. That is the body or the client or the person. By body, I mean the part of an institution, or the manager or the client who is receiving the report or who has requested it. In this case, your TA is your manager. You need to include your team's name. You also need to include the complete list of your team members' preferred full names and contact information. Keep in mind, you're practicing writing for a client, and if there are questions about your reports, we want to be able to get hold of you in an accessible way quickly. We don't want to have to be made, the social media that you use to communicate is your choice, so long as you are not making your team members download anything or learn a new form of social media. Keep in mind, your contact information should be compatible with your client and with your company. So text in this case isn't going to do it. To be accessible, you need email at this particular point in time. Keeping in mind that software changes, communication changes. We used to have to put in telephone numbers. Not anymore, thankfully. I want to give you a sample of an executive summary. You can try your hand at writing one, but this is not obligatory or required for this report. It is completely separate from the rest of the report, and that's what a lot of students have difficulty with. They tend to think that you have this executive summary that gives you the same information you have in the introduction and in the conclusions recommendations. And so some people don't even write an introduction. That's all wrong. The executive summary is a mini report of your report. It is completely separate from the rest. The reason you write it last is because you want to make sure that your conclusions and recommendations are firm, because they go into the executive summary. So the information that's included is, generally speaking, your purpose, objective, and question, very specifically, the situation and context, and any limitations on the scope of the content of your report. You want to quickly but concisely give your research methodology and your research results, that is your findings. You also want to give specific conclusions and recommendations. All too often, what I see in executive summaries are conclusions were drawn and recommendations were made. I'm sorry, but as a high-level manager, that doesn't give me the information that I need to get a high-level overview of your report's contents. You need to be specific. You need to tell us what those conclusions and recommendations are. And of course, you can feel free to use bullet points. If you have a number of conclusions and recommendations, then you have to triage and decide what the most important ones are, or reorganize so that you can take a group of conclusions or recommendations and give a high-level one-sentence summary of them. That's why you always write the executive summary last. It is the first thing people see, but the last thing you write. The table of contents is straightforward. I would simply point out you also have to include the author's name, who wrote what, in your table of contents. You do need page numbers, just insert them. Some departments and disciplines are really finicky about insisting that there should be no page number at all on the title page, and that the table of the executive summary and the table of contents uses Roman numerals, lowercase, and the page 1 doesn't start till you get to the introduction. I am not being finicky. I have had to struggle with those things myself for so long that I will tell you about them and not make you do them. I just want page numbers. So once again, do select a style sheet or heading times. Yeah, Edgar, I know. The last class I taught in engineering, one of the TAs did insist that students had to leave the title page clean, use those Roman numerals for, you know, the table of the executive summary and table of contents. They also had to do team biographies and a whole bunch of other stuff. And then the report page had to start with number 1. I understand in the case of 3rd and 4th year engineering students why a TA would make them do that. It's because they're about to go into the world and write real reports, and the practice is engineering is that you must do that. So you need to know how to do that. This is a 1st year class, and I am not making you do that. Page numbers is enough. Do decide on things like heading levels and also numbering styles for your headings, and use them. It's each team member's individual responsibility to use whatever the team has decided on, and if they use them incorrectly, to correct it themselves. Insert page numbers, use all the automated features that you can. So you can automate the TOC, you can also use the update feature to keep it up to date. The introduction, I cannot emphasize enough. Part of the reason I always make people do tables of contents is to separate the executive summary from the introduction. The introduction is completely separate from the executive summary, and you may find yourself in other courses or at work repeating information from the executive summary from the introduction. In fact, you write the introduction first, you can copy and paste some of that information into the executive summary if need be. But if you are doing executive summaries and introductions, please understand you need the introduction. You are going to repeat some of the same information, but in more detail. So the introduction should begin with the purpose, the objective, or the question that you are trying to answer in this report. It moves on to describe the context or situation that your purpose, objective, or question is answering. It describes why that is important to research or to answer. This is called the value or significance. You write about potential benefits, et cetera, of doing this research. And once again, it's going to repeat. The other thing you may want to include in the introduction is limitations so that you limit the scope of the project to something manageable. So you're writing a report on building a bridge, but you are not writing about the traffic and safety conditions because someone else's team is writing about that. So you limit the scope. In the middle of your report, once again, I think individual team members should be writing up the research results as they go. Presumably, you were assigned a task to research. You want to draft out the research you did and any findings that you got out of that research. The team can overall design the headings and the subheadings according to the topic. The individual can do so as well. You will find numerous suggestions in the chapter writing reports that is already on eClass, all kinds of alternative ways of structuring the middle of the report. I strongly suggest you read it, figure out where your report falls, and follow that. In this course, in all probability, no two reports will be alike in their design of the middle, meaning that the headings and the subheadings may be somewhat different. This is different from any of you who are taking a science course where you have to write lab reports. The lab report structure for each of the scientific disciplines tends to be quite rigid in the sections you include and the headings you give them. Other types of reports, such as the one that you're writing, are not. You design the middle logically according to your purpose and conclusions. You may need, as I said, to amalgamate your research, and you will need to show evidence to support your statements. And the evidence should lead us straight to those conclusions and recommendations. Conclusions and recommendations, it really depends. Some reports call for two separate sections. So you state your findings, and then you have a recommendation section that contains the calls to action. Some require one amalgamated section. Some call the closing section conclusions and expect both conclusions and recommendations in it. So you have a choice. You can have a separate conclusion section followed by a recommendation section, or you can call the closing section conclusions and recommendations. To make it very clear, because I get asked this all the time, conclusions are your findings. They're the statement of what you found based on your research. So as an example, York University's current strategies for international students are sound, but innovations would improve these students' experiences. Recommendations are calls for action to be taken. Therefore, York University should implement the following strategies for international students. We should find the evidence for both the conclusions and the recommendations in the middle of your report. Generally speaking, I would expect something more specific than this very general conclusion that I wrote myself, because it's not giving me the specific information I need. This might be an opening statement for the conclusion section, but I would expect to find more specific conclusions in it. The references section must cover all the sources of information your team used. Those include, but are not limited to, articles and books, websites, all types of interviews, including in-person, email, Zoom, or any other method of interviewing, illustrations, charts, and/or graphs, any other sources that you use to collect or gather information. Appendices, you don't need to include in your reports. What they're used for is to include very detailed information or evidence that would disrupt the flow of information if that material was included in the middle of the report. If you have an appendix, there should be a reference to it somewhere in the middle of the report so that you don't just give us this huge whack of detailed information without ever referring to it. We don't usually read appendices unless we're called upon to. So there should be some statement in the middle of your report. For instance, if you did do an interview and you don't want to summarize the entire interview in the body of the report because you want to draw selected points from the interview, in the middle of the report, you would say, the team interviewed such and such suggested. For a full summary of the interview itself, see Appendix A. And appendix are usually called Appendix A, Appendix B, Appendix C. So for collaborative writing, generally speaking, having the entire team write the entire report would be exceptionally difficult. So my suggestion is you write the objective, question, or purpose together so that you all agree on what it is and the wording of it. And you also write the conclusions and recommendations together so that you all agree on them. You assign each person a section or two of the middle of the report to write. Whoever is most familiar with the research for a section, should be writing that section. You should have all of your research findings on Google Docs or in some form that everyone can access them. You have to agree on a reviewing plan, which means you have to agree on dates for a draft of the report to be done so that you leave time for that reviewing process. Keep in mind, no one person is allowed to edit the report. It's got to be a team effort, and everyone should read all the sections. You should be reading them against the purpose that the entire team has agreed upon and against the conclusions and recommendations you've come to make sure that the middle supports those conclusions and recommendations and fulfills the purpose. You can try using Word's review features to add comments. Use anything you like. And you should set a deadline for review comments to be done and for revised sections to be posted. A couple of things you need to decide, and it's best to do this early. The first is vocabulary. The team needs to speak in one voice, not 4 or 5. So if there are common specialist terms or common terminology, you should decide on them ahead of time. Each team member should avoid using the word I. You are part of a team, you're writing on behalf of the team, so you use we or the team in place of the vertical pronoun. This gives you a coherent voice so that the entire team is speaking through each section. We also have one of the weakest parts of reports is transitions and flow through the middle when different people are writing them. Keep in mind that each section has to flow into the next, and the next section should in some way refer back to the previous section. You have to design those in deliberately to make sure that there is flow across the sections and that they're not all abrupt. So it's not essential. I mean, the last point about each section should follow the same overall order and end with conclusions about specific content of that section. As I said before, you may find that you want to move all the conclusions to the end. You don't want to overwhelm us, though, with 10 different conclusions at the end of a report. You should amalgamate some of those conclusions. You may also find that, for example, even the team writing about different types of music and their impacts on studying, it could very well be that you get to jazz, and you find that jazz has attributes or impacts that none of the other types of music do. So in that case, you're going to have additional subheadings under that particular category. So you do that. You can't force all content into a specific container. You have to allow for outliers. Any team that has not yet decided on a citation style needs to decide on it now, because you have to use in-text citations as well as include a reference section. So whatever style you use, you need to decide it now so that as people are writing, they can incorporate their sources as they go. This is another one of the weakest points in reports, where people do not cite their sources, and therefore the team loses credibility. If you have an entire section that doesn't have citations, you know, how can we trust the team? That concludes my part of the talk about the slides. I am going to stop sharing that. Going to go to a new share for a moment. I will be putting a sample team report that a previous team in this course wrote. It's a proposal for Ephemera, a student-run journal. The team agreed that I could use this for educational purposes, but they asked for their names to be taken off, so I have duly done so. You will find the executive summary that you don't have to write, but if you take a look at it, you should be able to get a good sense of the entire project from reading the one page. The one thing this team did not do was a table of contents, which means you have to read the entire document to find the information. The one thing I want to point out to you is the purpose is in the very first sentence. In this report, we propose to establish a new literary journal for undergraduate students at York to be titled Ephemera. I will leave this to you to read, but I will put it up on the website. In the meantime, do you have questions for me? Yes, the lecture slides will be posted on eClass, and I also try and post the recording as soon as possible after class. It really depends on whether I have to edit it or not. Generally speaking, I don't, but it does depend. If I forget to hit stop record, then I do have to edit to make sure that nobody's privacy is violated. So, are there any other questions? Tips for achieving the flow between individual sections. This really is a case of when the team reads over the report, they should know at some point what that middle is going to look like. So what is the design of the middle? If you move from, I'm going to go back to this for 1 second. So if you take a look at this sample, you see the resources available at York, and you see language and writing sources, Canadian culture resources, et cetera, et cetera. It's between the major sections. The team can actually plan to do things like you do when you're writing an essay and you're introducing a new topic. So, you know, you've been told the last sentence of a paragraph should, in essence, refer back to what you've just written and also contain some kind of looking forward. What you are doing at the beginning of each section. So for strengths of York's resources, you are echoing back to the past section by starting with something along the lines of, I am trying to think. So, resources available at York may be all encompassing. Some of them are stronger than others. That's a weak sentence, but you can see it contains the look back to the previous section. And now here's what you're going to find in this section. That's what I mean. Let me see. No question is a dumb question. Yes, because so I'm answering the question for the survival guide option. How do you recommend we find evidence to back up claims? For example, if we think York has a good academic advising resource and we compared it by looking at different university academic advising resources, and this person wants to hear my advice. That is by no means a dumb question. It's a very good one. So you've looked at other universities and you've discovered that their advising resources aren't as good as York's. So what I personally would do in those circumstances is to describe York's and compare it to those other two universities, saying York's has what these universities do not, or York's is easier to find and you are able to connect with someone immediately, whereas other universities, and you would cite evidence from those universities, fail in these categories or are weaker in these categories. Does that help? Hopefully. So I am going to stop sharing my screen. I want to take 2 minutes of your time. Yes, that would be adequate evidence as long as you back it up by showing us the evidence from the other universities. And, you know, you may be able to find evidence in the form of a newspaper article or something like that. There are news reports about inadequate mental health resources, for example, at various universities. You might be able to find the same type of article about various parts of a student survival guide.